Germany's reparations. After the Second World War. A few days ago, the Greek government has been on the verge of bankruptcy. In order to get rid of the crisis, came up with a brilliant plan to Germany to repay the reparations for the Second World War. According to the Greek side of the explanation, Germany still owes Greece the equivalent of 183.3 billion US dollars. Here is the exchange rate according to the present-day rate, the rest of the article statistics, according to the post-war exchange rate of the US dollar at that time, of the reparations, has already paid off all of them. Germany, which had already paid off all its war reparations, categorically rejected Greece's unreasonable demands. So, after the end of the Second World War, what was the situation of Germany's reparations? 1. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union established the principle of zonal reparations and demanded reparations in their respective German-occupied areas. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union established the principle of zonal reparations and demanded reparations in their respective German-occupied areas. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union established the principle of zonal reparations and demanded reparations in their respective German-occupied areas. As early as in the war against Germany, the major allies, that is, respectively, formulated a plan to claim compensation, but due to the different demands, so that in the Yalta Conference serious differences. The Soviet Union, which had suffered the greatest losses and hoped to obtain funds and equipment for post-war reconstruction from Germany, proposed that Germany pay $20 billion in reparations, of which $10 billion was to be given to the Soviet Union, $8 billion to Britain and the United States, and $2 billion to the other victorious countries, half of which was to be paid in industrial products, and the other half was to be obtained through the dismantling of equipment and the confiscation of Germany's overseas assets, of which $10 billion was to be given to the Soviet Union, $8 billion to Britain and the United States, and $2 billion to the other victorious countries, half of which was to be paid in industrial products, and the other half was to be obtained through the dismantling of equipment and the confiscation of Germany's overseas assets, half of which was to be paid in industrial products, and the other half was to be obtained through the dismantling of equipment and the confiscation of Germany's overseas assets. Britain was strongly opposed to the Soviet Union's proposal, arguing that it was more than Germany could afford. Churchill pointed out that if payment of imports could not be prioritized over payment of reparations, it would mean that other countries would be needed to pay reparations on Germany's behalf. And so it was expected that for some time after the war, the US and Britain would have to pay for food imports into the occupied territories. And at the same time, Britain feared that overexploitation of Germany would make it a source of war once again. The US, which was strong and undamaged by the war, did not expect to receive large reparations from Germany, but only agreed in principle to the amount of $20 billion. The dollars in the text are calculated at the pre-war, that is, 1938 exchange rate, in exchange for the Soviet Union's support on other issues. The US, which was strong and undamaged by the war, did not expect to receive large reparations from Germany, but only agreed in principle to the amount of $20 billion. The dollars in the text are calculated at the pre-war, that is, 1938 exchange rate, in exchange for the Soviet Union's support on other issues. The US, which was strong and undamaged by the war, did not expect to receive large reparations from Germany, but only agreed in principle to the amount of $20 billion. The dollars in the text are calculated at the pre-war, that is, 1938 exchange rate, in exchange for the Soviet Union's support on other issues. In fact, before the finalization of the policy of claims on Germany, the Soviet Union had already allocated a large part of the eastern part of Germany to Poland, where there were 12% of Germany's movable assets and a large amount of food stocks. And wherever the Soviet army passed through, it also dismantled its equipment on a large scale. These two moves undoubtedly weakened Germany's ability to make reparations, and indirectly reduced the amount of reparations that the US and Britain could obtain, in addition to which the US hoped to keep the Soviet Union outside of the Western zone of occupation, and therefore advocated the compensation principle at the Potsdam Conference. In addition, the US wanted to keep the Soviet Union out of the Western zone of occupation, so it advocated zonal reparations at the Potsdam Conference. The so-called zonal reparations principle, that is, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, later joined France from their respective occupation zones in Germany to obtain war reparations. The Soviet-occupied area is smaller. The territory is mainly for agriculture and light industry. The western zone of occupation is more economically developed, with the Ruhr area of the heavy industrial base, the United States and Britain for food, the USSR to get the industrial equipment. The Potsdam Agreement also stipulated that the USSR could obtain 25% of the dismantled equipment in the Western Zone, of which 40% was to be obtained free of charge and 60% was to be exchanged for food and other materials. The USSR initially did not agree to this principle, but the United States tied the issue of reparations to Germany to the issue of Poland's western border, and only if the USSR agreed to zonal reparations would the United States concede the issue of the Soviet Union's borders, and thus the USSR had to accept zonal reparations. The USSR had to accept the zonal reparations. 2. The USSR demolished everything that could be demolished and received the largest compensation, amounting to $17.1 billion US. In the early post-war period, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, at least in the weakening of Germany, this purpose is the same. But with the outbreak of the Cold War, the United States, in order to guard against the Soviet Union, the maintenance of European security began to focus on restoring the German economy. So in the Western occupation zone, the Allies demanded that Germany to give the reparations is less. In December 1945, the 18 Western Allies, including Greece, determined the proportion of material reparations in the Western zone in accordance with their losses in the war. They received a total of $502.3 million worth of material from the Western zone, of which the US, Britain, and France received $124 million. $106 million and $87 million, respectively. The Western countries dismantled little equipment, and the production capacity of the Western zone fell by only 8%. As a result, the production capacity of the Western occupation zone only declined by 8%. In addition, including the intellectual reparations of patents, trademarks, scientists, etc., taken by the U.S., the Western countries received reparations from Germany equivalent to about $5.15 to $6.44 billion. In contrast, the scale of Soviet demolition in the occupied territories was far greater than that of the U.S. and the U.K., which removed everything that could be removed: pipeline equipment, railroad tracks, telephones and exchanges, automobiles, indoor power stations, trams, machine tools, and even entire factories. Soviet officials claimed that 676 enterprises were demolished from the Soviet-occupied zone. Western scholars counting some of the demolished enterprises, the number can reach 1,367, 2,033. Statistics show that the level of production in the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany in 1946 was 75% lower than 2 years earlier, and that production capacity was only 55% of what it had been in 1936. A result that was 1/4 due to war damage, and 3/4 stemming from the Soviet Union's demolition spree. After the establishment of the GDR, the Soviet Union continued to obtain chemical and other industrial products from the GDR at prices substantially below market. In May 1950, the Soviet Union announced that it had received $3.658 billion in reparations, while reducing the total of $10 billion to $6.829 billion. And requiring the GDR to repay $211 million per year thereafter, a figure that did not include the so-called spoils of war that the Soviet Union had received from the Soviet-occupied territories. From 1944 onwards, the Soviet Union confiscated a large amount of property and hundreds of thousands of skilled workers from Germany in the name of spoils of war. If these were added, the USSR's reparations by 1953 might have amounted to $17.1 billion, so much more than it had demanded at the Yalta Conference that it was commented at the time that the West Germans were lucky that it was the East Germans who had borne all the blame for Hitler's war crimes. If these were added, the USSR's reparations by 1953 might have amounted to $17.1 billion, so much more than it had demanded at the Yalta Conference that it was commented at the time that the West Germans were lucky that it was the East Germans who had borne all the blame for Hitler's war crimes. If these were added, the USSR's reparations by 1953 might have amounted to $17.1 billion, so much more than it had demanded at the Yalta Conference that it was commented at the time that the West Germans were lucky that it was the East Germans who had borne all the blame for Hitler's war crimes. In May 1952, the Federal Republic of Germany and the Western Allies signed the Treaty of Bonn, which ended the military occupation by the United States, Britain, and France, except for Berlin, halted the dismantling, and exempted the Federal Republic of Germany from all reparation obligations. In order not to give the West the impression that it was insatiable, and to avoid triggering even greater unrest in the GDR due to overexploitation, the Soviet Union announced in 1953 that it would also drop all reparation claims against the GDR. Germany's reparations did not end there. In addition to paying reparations to the four major occupying powers, the GDR also paid 90 billion marks to the Jews of Israel and 1 billion marks to 12 countries in Eastern Europe by 1986, and Greece, which had already received war reparations at the Paris Reparations Conference, once again demanded reparations from Germany. As for Greece, which had already received war reparations from the Paris Reparations Conference, its renewed demand for reparations from Germany has no practical significance other than to create an international issue in order to cope with its domestic difficulties.